She wasn't just a maid, she was a thief, a mystery, and the one who changed my life forever. For most of my life I lived in a world of marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and endless parties filled with people who smiled too much, but meant too little. From the outside, my life seemed perfect. A sprawling estate, limitless wealth, and parents who could buy anything they wanted. But what they couldn't buy was time. My parents were always busy building their empire, leaving me to grow up surrounded by luxuries but not love. My days were filled with tutors, schedules, and rules, but loneliness had a way of finding me, even in the grandest of rooms. I'd look out at the world beyond the estate gates and wonder if there was more to life than this gilded cage I called home. That's when she arrived. It all began when my parents decided I needed help managing the house. "You can't handle all this by yourself," my mother said over breakfast one morning, barely glancing up from her tablet. I didn't argue. What was there to say? Delegation was their solution for everything, and hiring help seemed easier than proving them wrong. A week later, she appeared. Her name was Elena. She was younger than I expected, with strikingly dark eyes that seemed to hide entire lifetimes behind them. Her movements were graceful but precise, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders but wouldn't dare let it show. She spoke little, keeping to her work, but there was something about her presence that made it impossible not to notice her. At first I tried to ignore her. She was the help, after all, here to clean, organize, and fade into the background like everyone else who worked in our house. But Elena wasn't like everyone else. One evening, I caught her standing by the garden window, staring out at the sprawling grounds as the sun dipped below the horizon. She looked so small against the grandeur of the estate, yet there was a quiet strength about her that drew me in. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I said, stepping into the room. She startled, quickly lowering her gaze as though she wasn't allowed to admire something so simple as a sunset. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Sir?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do I really look that old?" Her lips quirked into the smallest of smiles before she quickly composed herself. "No, not at all. I just wasn't sure what to call you." "Call me whatever you like," I said, shrugging. But something in that moment shifted. For the first time, I saw her as more than a maid. She was a puzzle I didn't yet understand, a story waiting to be unraveled. In the days that followed, I found myself watching her more closely. The way her hands moved with quiet efficiency, the way she avoided eye contact yet carried herself with dignity. She wasn't just a maid, she was a mystery, and I was already too intrigued to turn away. The days turned into weeks, and despite my best efforts to keep a distance, I found myself drawn to Elena. It wasn't just her presence, it was her silence. She moved through the house like a ghost, always there but never lingering long enough to be seen. Yet, when our paths crossed, there was a quiet tension that neither of us could ignore. It started with the smallest of moments. A shared glance when she passed me in the hallway, her dark eyes meeting mine for the briefest second before she looked away. The way her hand brushed mine as she handed me a book I'd left in the study. Even the soft hum of her voice when she thought no one was listening. A melody so gentle it felt like it didn't belong in a house as cold and vast as mine. One evening, I found her in the library, meticulously dusting the shelves. She didn't notice me at first, her focus entirely on her work, but there was a sadness in the way she moved, an almost mechanical precision that seemed to shield her from something unseen. "You like books?" I asked, breaking the silence. She froze, startled by my voice. Slowly she turned to face me, clutching the cloth in her hands. I used to," she said, hesitantly. "Used to?" She nodded, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "There's not much time for reading when you're trying to survive." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't just sadness. It was the kind of guarded pain that comes from carrying too much for too long. Over time, those small moments became something more. A quiet conversation in the kitchen while she brewed tea, a walk through the garden where I pointed out the flowers my mother loved, and she smiled, a real smile, one that felt like a reward for breaking through her walls. "You don't seem like someone who belongs here," I said one day, as we sat by the fountain in the garden. She raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a smirk. "And what does someone who belongs here look like?" I chuckled, realizing my mistake. "I mean, you seem too alive for this place. Too real." For a moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. Then softly she said, You don't belong here either." Her words surprised me, but she wasn't wrong. In her presence, the house felt less suffocating, less cold. With Elena, I felt like more than just the heir to a fortune or the son of absent parents. The divide between us, the barriers of class, status, and expectation, should have kept us apart, but instead they brought us closer. She saw me, not the world I came from, and I was starting to see her too. It happened on a night that should have been like any other. The estate was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that hums with unease. I was working late in the study when I noticed it, the faint creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it, but something felt off. Rising from my chair, I stepped out of the study, my footsteps soft against the marble floor. That's when I saw her, Elena. She was slipping down the corridor toward the side exit, a small bag clutched tightly in her hands. My chest tightened as I watched her glance around nervously, her movements quick but deliberate. "Elena," I called, my voice sharp enough to make her freeze in her tracks. She turned slowly, her face pale as though she'd been caught mid-crime, because she had. Her dark eyes met mine, but this time they didn't hold the warmth or mystery I'd grown used to. Instead, they were filled with something else. Guilt. "What's in the bag?" I demanded, stepping closer. She hesitated, clutching the bag tighter as though it could shield her from my questions. It's nothing," she stammered, but her voice betrayed her. I reached for the bag and she didn't resist as I pulled it open. Inside were the unmistakable glint of my mother's heirloom necklace, my father's antique watch, and other pieces I recognized instantly. My throat tightened as realization set in. "You're stealing from me," I said, my voice breaking. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain. Instead, she turned away, her head bowed like she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "After everything, why would you do this?" Her silence was louder than any answer. It cut deeper than I thought possible. That night, Elena disappeared into the darkness, leaving the bag of stolen treasures behind, but taking something far more valuable with her: my trust. In the days that followed, anger consumed me. I replayed every moment we'd shared, searching for the signs I'd missed, the clues that should have warned me. How could I have been so blind? She was just another thief, wasn't she? Another opportunist who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. And yet, beneath the anger, was something far worse: heartbreak. I had trusted her. I had started to see her as more than a maid, more than someone who worked in my house. I'd begun to care for her in ways I hadn't allowed myself to care for anyone else. I should have hated her, but I couldn't. Despite everything, I couldn't forget the way her smile lit up the cold halls of my home. I couldn't erase the sound of her laughter or the softness in her voice when she spoke my name. And that was the cruelest betrayal of all. Weeks passed, but the ache of betrayal didn't fade. I told myself I was over it, that I didn't care where she had gone or what had become of her. But deep down, I couldn't stop wondering. Why had she done it? Why had she stolen from me, then left without a word? I didn't expect to find her again, least of all in the crowded streets of the city's old market. I was there on a whim, trying to escape the suffocating walls of my home. The bustling stalls and shouts of vendors barely registered as I wandered aimlessly, until a flash of familiarity caught my eye. Elena. She was seated on the edge of a fountain, her frame hunched over and her clothes wrinkled and worn. She wasn't the composed, graceful woman I had known. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale and weary. In her hands, she held a small loaf of bread, nibbling at it like it was the only thing she'd eaten in days. My feet moved before my mind could process what I was doing. "Elena," I said, my voice sharp. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, she looked ready to bolt, but she froze as our eyes met. There was no defiance in her gaze this time, only exhaustion and regret. I didn't think I'd see you again," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why would you?" I shot back. "You ran off after stealing from me, and now you're here pretending nothing happened?" She flinched at my words, the bread slipping from her hands. "I didn't pretend," she said softly. "I've lived every day since that night regretting what I did. You have every right to hate me." Her honesty disarmed me, but anger still burned in my chest. "Then why did you do it, Elena? Why did you lie to me?" She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling. "I didn't want to. I never meant to hurt you. But my family, they needed the money. My father is sick and my little brother, he's just a child. We were drowning in debt and I was desperate. I thought I thought I could take what I needed and leave before you noticed." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and tears glistened in her eyes. "But then I got to know you, and every time I smiled at you, every time you spoke to me with kindness, it made what I was doing feel so much worse." I stood there, torn between anger and something softer, something harder to name. I wanted to yell at her, to demand answers she didn't have, but the sight of her, so small and fragile, broke through my defenses. "You could have asked me for help," I said finally, my voice quieter now. She laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes. "Help? From someone like you? I thought you'd never understand." But in that moment, as I looked at her, I realized I understood far more than she thought. The drive back from the market felt like a storm brewing in my chest. Elena sat silently beside me, staring out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't resisted when I told her to come with me, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. When we arrived at the estate, the confrontation I'd been dreading came faster than expected. My mother was in the foyer, her expression turning icy the moment she saw Elena step through the door. "She has no place here," my mother said sharply, crossing her arms. "Do you know what people would say if they knew you brought a thief back into this house?" "She's not a thief," I replied, though my voice wavered. She was desperate." "Don't be naive," my mother snapped. "Desperation doesn't excuse betrayal. You need to think about this family, about what it means to trust someone like her." The words stung because a part of me agreed with her. Elena had stolen from us, from me. I had every reason to turn her away, to call the authorities and let her deal with the consequences of her actions. But another part of me, the part that couldn't stop thinking about the tears in her eyes or the raw vulnerability in her voice, couldn't let go of the connection we'd shared. Later that evening, I found Elena in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, the moonlight casting soft shadows across her face. She didn't look up as I approached, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "They want me to turn you in," I said quietly, breaking the silence. Her head lifted slightly, but she didn't meet my eyes. "I wouldn't blame you if you did," she said, her voice resigned. "It's what I deserve." "You think you deserve that?" I asked, anger creeping into my voice. Not at her, but at the hopelessness in her tone. She shrugged. "What else do I have to offer? I've taken from you, from your family. All I have left is the truth. I cared about you, even when I knew I shouldn't, even when I knew it would end like this." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I sat beside her, the cool stone pressing against my hands. "If you cared, why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" Finally, she turned to me, her eyes glistening. "Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid you'd look at me the way everyone else does, like I'm nothing." The silence stretched between us as I searched for an answer. My family's voice echoed in my mind, urging me to choose pride, to protect what was ours. But my heart was louder. "I don't hate you," I said softly. "But if I forgive you, you have to promise me something." Her gaze locked on mine. "Anything. Don't run. Stay. Let's face this together." Forgiving Elena wasn't easy. It meant defying everything I'd been taught: family, loyalty, pride, and the belief that betrayal deserved punishment. But love doesn't follow rules. And the moment I saw the hope flicker in her eyes as I told her to stay, I knew my choice was made. The fallout was swift. My parents didn't shout or argue. They simply turned cold. My father barely looked at me, muttering something about throwing it all away for a thief. My mother was more direct. "If you choose her, you're no longer one of us," she said. The words should have hurt more, but instead, I felt an unexpected relief. For so long I'd been living under their expectations, carrying the weight of a life that never felt like mine. Now, for the first time, I could see a future where I made my own choices. Elena and I decided to leave the estate. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No slammed doors or tearful goodbyes. Just a quiet departure, a suitcase in one hand and her hand in the other. We found a small apartment in the city, far from the sprawling estate and the suffocating legacy of my family's name. It wasn't much: peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and a single window that overlooked a busy street. But it was ours. And for the first time, that was enough. The first few weeks were hard. Trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I'd catch her looking out the window and wonder if she was planning to leave. But every time, she stayed. She worked tirelessly, taking on small jobs to help us get by. And at night, when we sat on the worn couch in our tiny living room, she'd tell me about her dreams, the art she wanted to create, the places she longed to see. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. Elena encouraged me, reading every word I put on paper, even the ones I was too embarrassed to share. In her, I found not just love, but inspiration, a reason to believe in myself and in the future we were building. One night, as we sat beneath the dim glow of the single lamp in our apartment, I asked her, "Do you regret staying?" She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made the world feel brighter. "I regret a lot of things," she said, taking my hand in hers. "But not this, not us." Looking back, I realized that love isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, and often built on fragile foundations. But it's also transformative. It heals wounds you didn't know you had and gives you the strength to face the world, no matter how flawed you are. Elena didn't just take everything from me. She gave me something far greater in return, a reason to start over, to build a life not bound by wealth or expectations but by love and hope. What would you do for love? Would you defy everything, your family, your pride, for someone who touched your soul? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more heartfelt and dramatic tales. And if you know someone who believes in second chances or the power of love, share this video with them. You might just inspire them today.